Good afternoon. 5:06 here on News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Chinese President Xi Jinping set to skip this week's Group of 20 summit in India, as bilateral relations remain very icy between the United States and China. That's according to the Associated Press. Here is a reporter asking Biden this weekend in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, whether he's disappointed about Xi's coming absence.
I am disappointed, but I'm going to get to see him.
I am disappointed, but I am going to get to see him, he said. I'm also seeing a report today from Reuters that the Chinese are now saying that any chance of a Biden-Xi meeting, including later this year in San Francisco, will depend on the United States, quote, showing sufficient sincerity. What's going on here? Let's ask our next guest, Gordon Chang. He is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. He's also on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, good to have you with us, sir.
Thank you so much, Vince.
What's happening here? How seriously should we take Xi Jinping not appearing at this G20 summit?
We don't know what's happening. Everyone says that Xi Jinping is not going to India because he wants to snub Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. And that's possibly true. But I'm glad that you pointed out that the Ministry of State Security about 24 hours ago issued that statement, which hinted that Xi Jinping may not go to the APEC summit in San Francisco in November, which means that maybe Xi Jinping is not in travel mode. And by the way, at this moment, he's not in Jakarta for the ASEAN summit, which he might have attended. So really what we've got right now is, I think, a Chinese leader who's at home. He is, I think, worried about leaving China because there are so many problems. And he very well may think that he might not be entitled to come back to China if he were to leave, for instance, for New Delhi.
How about that? So this isn't a commentary necessarily on the relationship between the United States and China. It could be more about volatility inside of his own country.
Yes. As I said, we don't know. But I don't think that it really makes sense for Xi Jinping to sort of flip the middle finger to Narendra Modi at this particular time. We do know that Xi Jinping has been criticized by Communist Party elders for taking the country too far in the wrong direction. That occurred last month, according to some reports. We also know of high-level turbulence. There are rumors circulating around Beijing, which the rumors are probably not true, but the fact that the rumors are there suggests that someone's trying to destabilize China's leader, and the fact that those rumors are permitted to circulate on social media indicates that someone really does want to do in China's leader.
When you hear that Chinese spy agencies suggest that the United States needs to demonstrate sufficient sincerity towards China and Xi Jinping, what does that mean to you? What are they referencing?
Well, they're probably talking about a number of things the Biden administration has done which they don't like. So, for instance, the chip rules of last October. And also there have been minor sanctions imposed on China. And even the smallest of these costs irritate Beijing to no end, because they believe that they're the center of the world. They have a right to rule the solar system. And I'm not exaggerating, by the way, because Chinese officials talk about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. But putting that aside, we have a political system in China right now that believes that everyone owes allegiance to Beijing. And by the way, Biden is responsible in part for creating that impression because he has sent 4 of his senior officials to China and has not requested a return visit from a senior Chinese official to Washington. So Biden is basically telling Xi Jinping, look, I believe that the United States is a supplicant to China because I'm not insisting on what is normal, which would be a return visit.
Right. He's projecting weakness by not expecting, basically, as they would say, equitable treatment.
Yes, and this is unprecedented to send 4 senior officials without a return visit. So, Xi Jinping reasonably thinks that Biden believes that he's a vassal, that the United States owes allegiance to China. And while we Americans may think that sounds ludicrous, these Chinese officials right now have gone off the deep end.
One of the other pieces of Biden's relationship with China that stands out, other than, obviously the bribes flowing to his family, is the green energy economy seems to be almost entirely dependent on goods that are made in China. How intertwined is Biden's so-called green energy agenda and the Chinese government?
Well, so very much, as you point out. I mean, virtually all the solar panels in the world are made in Xinjiang or with materials from Xinjiang. And that means, as a Los Angeles-based NGO pointed out, almost all of the solar panels in the world are made with forced or slave labor. Biden knows this. It's illegal to bring those products into the U.S. That's the Tariff Act of 1930, plus the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act of 2021. But Biden is bringing them in anyway through subterfuges. Chinese know what's going on, and so they look at Biden and saying he's not willing to enforce his own basic law. This is one of the basic laws of the United States. You cannot import forced enslaved labor products into America, and yet Biden is doing it. And basically what he's saying is, yeah, we need China's green energy products.
It's amazing, isn't it? And they give us all these lectures on American history and slavery and everything else. And meanwhile, their agenda is being propped up by a reliance on forced labor.
Yeah, and by the way, let's remember, this forced labor is part of a program of genocide and other crimes against humanity, the worst atrocities the world has seen since the Third Reich. So I don't want any lectures from the President of the United States about slavery or racial discrimination or anything, because if you're supporting genocide, then you have put yourself beyond the pale.
Let's stay on the issue of China for a moment. The Wall Street Journal has a report this week headlined, Chinese gatecrashers at U.S. bases spark espionage concerns. The piece goes on to detail hundreds of occasions upon which Chinese foreign nationals have attempted to enter U.S. military bases, sometimes successfully. And among the efforts that they've made include claims as they arrive at the gate that they were being led to McDonald's or Burger King by their Google Maps, or that there were other incidents where people just pushed past the guards, including at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, and to get onto the base. And the article claims that this is an intelligence gathering exercise and that many of the Chinese nationals who are doing this are doing it under duress as their government back home is promising negative outcomes for their families if they don't abide. What else can you tell us here?
Well, if we had one or two incidents, you could say, well, maybe that's just accident. But when you have 100, which is what the Wall Street Journal is talking about, which is based on a leak from senior administration officials, then it's a pattern. And it means essentially that we are being overwhelmed. The FBI is overwhelmed. Other federal law enforcement agencies are overwhelmed. States are overwhelmed, which means that we have a serious issue with Chinese nationals and Chinese entities in our country. And if we don't start dealing with this effectively, which I believe means expelling many of them, then we are going to lose our country. Remember, there's that Fresno lab that had about 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to transmit disease. It was a Chinese operation. That means that they were thinking of killing even more Americans. So let's understand what's going on here. And I know that people get squeamish about this, but remember, every Chinese national is under a legal compulsion to commit espionage against the United States. Every Chinese national, because of the Communist Party's top-down system, is under a compulsion to commit acts of sabotage against the United States. We're not going to keep our country unless we deal with this.
It certainly seems that way. I was talking to Philip Lenzicki over at the Daily Caller News Foundation this past week, and we were discussing how there's a company that is in Michigan. The Chinese parent company is Gotion, and they are set to build 2 electric battery plants now in Michigan with the blessing of the Biden administration. And Philip has just obtained video of many of the employees of that parent company going on a field trip to various communist landmarks in China and making a pledge to join the Communist Party and to work for its goals as long as they live and promise never to betray the party. This sounds exactly like what you're talking about.
Yes, and if you go on X, formerly Twitter, you can see pictures of those employees dressed in Maoist uniforms. Philip has done great work. Another story that he did was he detailed how there are at least 7 and maybe 9 other Chinese police stations in the U.S. that the Biden administration has not closed. Yes, they closed the one in New York's Chinatown, but there are many more still that are operating.
Gordon Chang, how vulnerable is the average Chinese national to being exploited while they're here in the United States by their own government for espionage purposes?
Well, if anyone loves their relatives and their relatives are in China, then they're extremely subject to demands of the Communist Party. And that's the reason why we have so many cases of Chinese nationals engaged in illegal activities in our country. And as remember, that's the nature of their system. So if we were to expel Chinese nationals, this is not racism. This is just a recognition of the Chinese system that requires them legally to commit acts of espionage. So we have to understand that our society is now at great risk. We have all of these saboteurs, I believe, coming into our country across the southern border. You know, most Chinese nationals who are escaping their country are who they say they are. They have given up on China. But we also know that there are people, extremely suspicious people, coming across that border. Packs of 5 to 15 of Chinese males, unattached to family groups,
yes,
pretending not to speak English, and are known to have Chinese military links.
Well, it strikes me that the thing we were talking about a little bit earlier, the identity politics obsession of the left, is actually preventing us from having a realistic debate on this subject. It's almost like if you even bring it up, that you're engaging in an act of bigotry, even though you're raising legitimate concerns.
Absolutely, and we got to remember that if you, if you're a leftist and you raise those issues, then you're yourself a racist, because you're saying that because of racism, we should not defend the United States. That is just wrong. We have to understand, under the Chinese system, as I mentioned, every Chinese national in the United States is under compulsion to commit crimes, and that is a fact.
And you're not overstating it.
No. The Article 7 and 14 of China's 2017 National Intelligence Law requires every Chinese national to commit acts of espionage if required by a relevant authority of China, almost a direct quote. And under the Communist Party's top-down system, nobody can resist the demand from the Communist Party. So that is, that's there. And if you say we're not going to defend ourselves because of the race of the people who are, required to destroy the United States, well, then that's racism.
Yes, indeed. Let me move to North Korea now. North Korea news this week, in fact, today. The United States said Monday that it expects North Korean leader Kim Jong Un to make a rare trip abroad, I assume with his private toilet on the flying in to Russia. President Vladimir Putin is set to meet with him. They're going to talk about arms for Moscow's war in Ukraine. What do you make of this news?
Yeah, probably in Vladivostok and probably on Kim Jong Un's armored train. So yes, he will have the private toilet, but it will not be in the air. And what we are seeing, though, is the congealing of a new axis. That axis is led by China, has North Korea and Russia in it, and they are working together. And Russia just a few hours ago announced that North Korea has been invited to participate in joint naval exercises with China and Russia. So we are seeing, a lot of Americans say, I don't want a Cold War. Well, it's already there, and we're just not defending ourselves.
Gordon Chang, as always, great analysis. You can find Gordon Chang on Twitter, now X, at Gordon G. Chang. Sir, thank you very much. All right, a couple of quick items for you, all relevant to the news in your life. Montgomery County, Maryland. We're seeing a letter here shared by Clay Travis of Outkick. He writes on X, on Twitter, a D.C. area elementary school, Montgomery County, Maryland, is reinstating a mask mandate, N95s, for third graders over a few kids who tested positive for COVID. Here's the letter. They're coming with masks for your kids again. Get ready. Read this insanity. And he posted, this is a letter sent today for Rosemary Hills Elementary School. Dear parents and students of students in this classroom, that would be the third grade classroom, This letter is to inform you that 3 or more individuals have tested positive for COVID-19 in this class in the past 10 days. We are taking the following steps to keep our school environment as safe as possible for in-person teaching and learning and to prevent further transmission of COVID-19. They say that KN95 masks have been distributed and students and staff in the identified classes or activities will be required to mask while in school for the next 10 days, except while eating or drinking. Then they'll be optional again after the 10 days. They also say they're sending home at-home rapid test kits and making them available for students. And they want everybody to test at least 5 days after an exposure, starting day 6, or any time if symptoms develop, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, masks coming back to an elementary school classroom near you for no good reason. You heard Dr. Marty McCary talking earlier in the program. The Cochrane study, the most comprehensive study on this subject ever conducted, has concluded that there is no benefit to the masking. And of course, with kids, there were only drawbacks to it. It only hurt them throughout the course of that ridiculous government-imposed chaos. So Montgomery County said, that's A-okay with us. Let's try it again. We had such a great time the first go-around. Madness. Also, an update for you from Julie Kelly. We talked to her yesterday about all this January 6th footage that was supposed to be released by Congress. She said they were tapping the brakes on that. But now she says after talking with House Republicans over the past few days, it is her understanding that now hours of January 6th footage will be made available to the public very soon. She said this is the start of rolling production of January 6th clips for public access. You got to wonder, could it be the Vince Coglianese Show? I'm not saying it was. I'm just saying it probably was. It's 5:29. Well, good afternoon to you. It is 5:35 now. News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Hope you had a very nice Labor Day weekend. Great to have you with us this afternoon. You can join us on the air at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. I mentioned earlier in the program that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act has only accelerated in inflation. And in fact, the green energy companies who are making so much money off of you and I, excuse me, that would be you and me. They've jacked up their prices now. So we are paying 50% of their costs, and they've decided to raise their costs by over 50%. You like that game? It's the same game that they play with student loans. So the federal government comes in and they subsidize all of these student loans. They pay massive amounts of money, and then the schools all jack up their prices, and that's why the cost of tuition has always outpaced inflation as long as the government's been involved. You understand this is not to your benefit. So when these government officials come along, these politicians, and they say, hey, we'll just start giving more money to this industry, all it does is jack up the prices for everybody, and the only people who benefit are that industry. And then, of course, the products get worse and worse. Has college education improved at all over the last 50 years? No, is the answer. It's just become more diminished and crappier, and it's churning out a lot more left-wing zealots, but not actually producing the kind of productive people that it's supposed to. And the same is true of this stupid green energy industry. The promise of being able to create more effective batteries, efficient batteries, and new power sources, that's awesome. The market forces would take care of something like that. But when you get the government involved, it basically means that you have crappy technologies that continue to be subsidized, and then they elevate their prices because they're taking advantage of the taxpayer and cashing out. So, hooray! It's great for all of us. Well, no, not at all. So, here's an update for you on some of the climate nonsense that's going on, some of the other climate nonsense that's going on. There's a scientist today writing on a website called The Free Press. It is The Free Press is a publication, an excellent publication, produced by a former columnist for the New York Times by the name of Barry Weiss. And she put together this website where they report things that are true that don't usually get much of a hearing in the corporate media. And boy, is this one of them. The name of this scientist is Dr. Patrick T. Brown. Not a real doctor, he's a PhD, but he's a climate scientist. He's a climate scientist. And he writes in the Free Press today, headline, "I left out the full truth to get my climate change paper published." I left out the full truth to get my climate change paper published. And so what he says is that he just, this very week, had a paper published in Nature magazine. Nature magazine. It's a prestigious journal called Nature, one of the most prestigious. In fact, Nature and Science are the two big dogs on the block, and scientists all over the world would like to get their work published in these journals because then they are considered to be serious. They are taken. This is a big moment in your career that you get it published in such a prestigious journal. And Patrick Brown is kind of giving the game away this week intentionally because he wants to know how much he had to modify and censor his own knowledge in order to get this paper published. Now, let me just point out up front. He says extensively in this that he says climate change is a very real phenomenon, and I think most people agree with that. The climate changes, clearly. And he says that it has all sorts of effects on the planet as it changes. He doesn't talk at all in this article about the role that man plays, if it's meaningful, if it's small, if it's huge, nothing like that. He just says that, it is proper to reflect on the effect that climate has on things like natural disasters, and that includes wildfires. But he also says that in order to get this paper published, he had to exclude all sorts of other considerations that he thinks are much more important than climate change. Let me quote a little bit from this and emphasize that he's talking about wildfire behavior. That's what the paper's about. He says this, "The paper I just published, called Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California, focuses exclusively on how climate change has affected extreme wildfire behavior. I knew not to try to quantify key aspects other than climate change in my research because it would dilute the story that prestigious journals like Nature and its rival Science want to tell. This matters because it is critically important for scientists to be published in high-profile journals. In many ways, they are the gatekeepers for career success in academia. And the editors of these journals have made it abundantly clear, both by what they publish and what they reject, that they want climate papers that support certain pre-approved narratives, even when those narratives come at the expense of broader knowledge for society. To put it bluntly, climate science has become less about understanding the complexities of the world and more about serving as a kind of Cassandra. A Cassandra is a reference from Greek mythology, someone who's a kind of a soothsayer who nobody believes, who's warning of impending doom all the time. He goes on here, urgently warning the public about the dangers of climate change. However understandable this instinct may be, it distorts a great deal of climate science research, misinforms the public, and most importantly, makes practical solutions more difficult to achieve. So what happens in this piece, Patrick Brown goes on to say that, look, there's all sorts of things that humanity has done really, really well. Really, really well. And you heard Vivek Ramaswamy make this point the other day with Andrea Mitchell on MSNBC. Vivek says, wait a second, a lot fewer people are dying due to extreme weather events these days than 100 years ago. A lot fewer. In fact, we are doing fantastic. It used to be like 100 people died. Now it's one person dies, whatever the statistic is that he wielded. And it was an impressive statistic. And the reason for that is obvious. Society's become better at producing power. That power helps to generate heating and air conditioning, climate control for inside of a home. The likeliness that you're going to die due to extreme heat or extreme cold has been diminished by human progress. That has been a huge thing. Fossil fuels have been at the center of that success, of that human flourishing. Cheap, available fuel has been good for everybody, from poor to rich. It's been an amazing thing. Also, the way we build structures has become better. We build homes and buildings and businesses in a more durable way that can withstand extreme weather events. And you can go on and on down the list. Mankind is better at surviving nature's wrath now thanks to ingenuity and abundant natural resources. That's just true. And so what Patrick Brown says today is that in order to get this paper published, he couldn't talk about any of those things. He wants people to understand that in the face of, quote, climate change, we can't just talk about trying to change the climate. You can't say, I want to control the weather. One of the other conversations you should have, and the more important one, is what do we do to make it so that more people survive and flourish? What can be done? How do we get more air conditioning into more homes? How do we get more heat into more homes? How do we make it so that people don't have to turn off their heating and cooling system during peak times in places like California or the United Kingdom? So he continues here. In my recent Nature paper, which I authored with 7 others, I focused narrowly on the influence of climate change on extreme wildfire behavior. Make no mistake, that influence is very real. But there are also factors that can be just as or more important, he says, such as poor forest management and the increasing number of people who start wildfires, either accidentally or purposely. A startling fact, over 80% of wildfires in the United States are ignited by humans. All right, pause. How many times have we talked about wildfires? You know how this story goes. A wildfire breaks out in California. A wildfire breaks out in West Maui. A wildfire breaks out in Canada, right? And then a couple days later, when at least people on the conservative side of the aisle are available to talk about this, when we all come to our senses, we say, wait a second, what was the forest management like in that place? Were they doing controlled burns? Were they, for environmental purposes, artificially allowing everything to overgrow so much that it generated immense amounts of powerful fuel in order to generate a wildfire that would just devastate communities? What's the answer to that question? And the left doesn't want to answer that question. They don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to talk about forest management because, by and large, they're responsible for creating the crappy conditions that led to the utterly destructive fire that could have been prevented in the first place. So this scientist is saying, why are we talking about climate change? Why aren't we talking about forest management? Do we want to save lives or not? That's his point. Additionally, he says these wildfires are all started by humans. 80% of them are started by humans. The fire in Maui is believed to have been started, I saw, at least in the early days, by power lines. A human cause. It wasn't lightning striking Maui. It was a power line going down. Flames. Burning parts of western Maui. The devastation there, just unbelievable. He says here, a much more useful analysis would focus on changes in climate from the recent past that living people have actually experienced, and then forecasting the foreseeable future, the next several decades, while accounting for changes in technology and resilience. Basically, talk about how man can deal with nature. In the case of my recent Nature paper, this would mean considering the impact of climate change in conjunction with anticipated reforms to forest management practices over the next several decades. In fact, our current research indicates that these changes in forest management practices could completely negate the detrimental impacts of climate change on wildfires. Let me repeat that last part. This is a climate scientist claiming that if we just changed forest management practices, we would, quote, completely negate the detrimental impacts of climate change. I'm sorry, doesn't that seem like the screaming headline here? You want to stop death due to wildfires? You've got a climate scientist telling you better forest management would, quote, completely negate the effect. Completely. And he wasn't allowed to say that. He says this week he wasn't allowed to put any of this in that report for Nature magazine, for that journal, Nature. And it wasn't that they told him keep it out. He knew he had to if he had any chance of getting published. He says that universities all across the country and around the world are churning out way too many PhDs now, which means there's a lot of competition to appear in these journals. Everybody and their mother wants to get into these journals. And you have a tightly controlled environment where the editors are only choosing politically tailored content to appear in these journals. And this is why, in the end, you get these ridiculous 97% of scientists say that it's your SUV that caused the weather in Florida. And it's like, what? How did we get to this point? How did 97% of scientists all get to that point? And the answer is found in this story. It's the corruption and capture of an industry that is supposed to be inquisitive and instead has foreclosed on asking questions and instead has just given us, here's the answer, according to the politics of the moment. One other piece here that you should know about. The Federalist, the publication The Federalist, has been doing a great job of documenting all of the scientists who now say that the panicked climate emergency is a bunch of hooey, that it's garbage. And the headline this week is that they now have a second Nobel Prize winner who has just signed a letter joining 1,600 scientists declaring the so-called climate emergency to be a myth. This is a myth. Okay, so you have 1,600 scientists. 2 of them are Nobel Prize winners who are now saying this. A coalition of more than 1,600 scientists, critical of their peers' hyperbolic claims about climate change, drew a prominent recruit to sign their 2019 declaration that the climate, quote, emergency is a myth. John Clauser, who won last year's Nobel Prize in Physics, became the second Nobel laureate last month to sign the document with 1,607 other scientists rebuking the idea of a climate crisis. Quote, climate science should be less political, while climate policies should be more scientific, the declaration, organized by the Climate Intelligence Foundation, reads. Scientists should openly address uncertainties and exaggerations in their predictions of global warming, while politicians should dispassionately count the real costs as well as the imagined benefits of their policy measures. Last year, the International Energy Agency, IEA, debuted a roadmap to net zero emissions that became the model for corporate bishops of environmental, social, and governance standards. That's ESG. You're familiar with that. A June report from the Energy Policy Research Foundation criticized the initiatives outlined as a green mirage. The IEA roadmap, researchers wrote, will dramatically increase energy costs, devastate Western economies, and increase human suffering. Repeat, increase human suffering. The practices of the American left are to increase human suffering. Who said this recently? This goes right back to Vivek again, doesn't it? What did Vivek Ramaswamy say on that debate stage? He said that the climate agenda is a hoax and that more people are being killed by and will be killed by the left's policy prescriptions here than the climate itself. And Andrea Mitchell flipped. She freaked out. She couldn't even believe that he would say something so true and so real and so obvious in public. And he did. Finally, this World Climate Declaration here says this: the aim of global policy should be prosperity for all by providing reliable and affordable energy at all times. There is no climate emergency. Therefore, there is no cause for panic and alarm. They say Norwegian-American engineer Ivan Gjaver, I probably screwed up his name, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1973. He's also a signatory to the declaration. Anyway, some good news there. It seems like reality is breaking through. And at least one scientist who was published in a major journal, which, by the way, lied about COVID and its origins. That's what Nature magazine did. They're out there now just smashing the alarm to let people know what's really going on. Let's take a call. Tom from Washington, D.C., line 4. Tom, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Thanks. Make it real quick. And that is that you got to look back into history going your time when I was a little kid. Back in the late 60s, early 70s. The people driving this, many of them are the descendants of either the people of that time or descendants of those with the anti-population growth.
Yes.
This idea is, we need to protect. No, they want less people, and they want more misery. They also want complete control over the economy. It's socialism. AOC's chief of staff admitted it when he left and went to work for another organization. It's really not about climate change. It's about control.
It's about power, and it's certainly not about people. What was your first hint? Was it the million babies a year that they sacrificed to their cause? Might have played a role. Let's see. Oh, the great one, Mark Levin. He's up next right here on WMAL.